Thank you for joining us for this public holiday edition of In Focus. I am Thabo Mdluli. As we mark this day of reconciliation, it seems fitting to ask ourselves if we have made any progress in creating a more tolerant society. South Africa created the National Plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances in 2019. What inroads have we made since then? To help me unpack this, I'm joined now by social analyst and political commentator Tessa Dooms, Nelson Mandela University Associate Professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, Professor Christi van der Westhuizen. We also have the National Director at Lawyers for Human Rights, Ncube, and Anti-Apartheid activist Trevor, Ngwane, social activist Mhlanga, and we'll be joined by Lwazi Mzobe as well from uMkhonto, weSizwe Military Veterans Association. You're a part of the conversation. That question for you tonight: does the problem of racism still remain firmly on the national agenda, or do we have an incidence-based response? 072-110-5584. Tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. As already I mentioned, we do have what is called a national action plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other intolerances. The question is, does this go far enough, or has it gone far enough? Firstly, to deal with some of the cited objectives, one of which is to address the legacy of racial domination, discrimination, and inequality, social injustice, as well as economic disempowerment. If we break those down to their granular details, what do we find, Prof. Christi?
Good evening. Very good to be with you this evening. I do think, yes, we've got the National Action Plan. I think it was disquieting that it took us a very long time to get to the point of actually having a plan, because it comes out of the World Conference Against Racism that was held in 2001 in Durban as a United Nations event that South Africa hosted at the time. And the National Action Plan actually flowed from that. It took us almost 20 years just to get the action plan adopted by Cabinet. And if we look at the plan, it's quite wide-ranging. It includes, for example, having a baseline indication of levels of racism, xenophobia, and so forth. It talks about doing further research, talks about public education, and so forth and so on. But and it also talks about a rapid response mechanism, so that we can pick up, for example, on where xenophobic attacks might flare up, and so forth, where that is not 100% clear. But I think in terms of really mobilizing society around the vision of the National Action Plan, we haven't really had enough of that. And the very important point for me is, when we're talking also on the Day of Reconciliation, is that the fact of the matter remains that you might be addressing individual instances of racism, but if you don't address structural racism, then we actually remain caught up in the problem. And structural racism is basically, if we look at the fact that some 50% of our population, of which the vast majority are black people, are locked into structural poverty. And that is a form that's a result of the structural racism of apartheid. And the fact that we haven't actually succeeded in socioeconomic transformation to a large extent is also what has kept us caught up in structural racism. And the National Action Plan talks about it, but how we get out of it is another. Well, it's the major challenge that's before us.
Prof, I'm going to come back to you on that point. Poverty still largely coinciding with race and ethnicity in South Africa, and what does that actually tell us? But Trevor, let's bring you in here. As far as you're concerned, there is a plan that we said we are putting in place. It will deal with racial domination and discrimination and inequality. Do you find that we have managed to make any inroads, or are we still seeing a dominance of a particular racial group in South Africa and a discrimination of another?
Thank you very much. I just want to build on what Christi was saying about, the structural components of racism, or the dynamics between the reproduction of racial discrimination. So basically, South Africa is what you can call a form of racial capitalism. So it is built on the super exploitation of black cheap labor. For example, the migrant labor system. Remember, we had the Marikana massacre in 2012. Those miners were demanding a living wage and an end to the system of super exploitation of black labor. Clearly, this continues. So in a nutshell, I think as long as this system of racial capitalism, continues, there will be many, many problems. Largely the continuation of past oppressions, exploitations into the so-called New South Africa. And my last point here would be to say that, race, class tends to go together also with gender. So if you're a black young woman in South Africa, and you are working class, you are likely to suffer many, many social injustices. So this is a problem which, the ANC government has not at all scraped its surface.
Yeah. Is it a problem that would need policies and measures in place that are aimed at addressing particularly those disparities that are wealth related when it comes to black people in South Africa in particular?
Well, look, today is Day of Reconciliation. What is this holiday? What is its origins? The youth maybe do not know. This was called Dingan's Day. This was the colonizer celebrating, his victory, his war of conquest, where, the Boer republics, defeated Dingaan, the king of the Zulus. What was the colonizer after? He was after land. He was after our wealth, resources. So basically, as long as the land has not been returned, as long as the wealth has not been returned, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to say you are doing justice to issues of racial justice, equality.
Yeah. Tessa, we had what we call in 2001 to 2010 a decade of national mobilization against racism. But even as early as July, even now, in fact, the country is involved in a process with the Human Rights Commission where we are investigating what could have been a racially motivated attacks, right? And we're largely still seeing those incidences, and that's what we are responding to. Did that decade of mobilization actually have any impact?
As somebody who actually follows politics pretty closely, that had actually slipped me, which means the mobilization effort was really a dismal fail, if that was what was intended in that decade. And what's more is that there's been a lot of focus in the post-apartheid era, in the new South Africa era, when it comes to race, on trying to build what we call social cohesion through mythology building and the building and the using of emotive language and opportunities to get people to feel like they are part of a single moment of unity, rather than doing the work that comes with socialization towards that end. If you think about what the apartheid government did and how we got into this situation in the first place, they really had two big weapons as the apartheid regime in order to get us here. The one was policy, and there was a lot of policy thrown into the mix to make what was essentially an economics project of lifting up poor white Afrikaner people out of the relative poverty they were experiencing and using racial policies to do it. And so there was a big policy project that was undertaken. And I think South Africa has not taken a similar serious policy project that understands what those statistics around poverty and unemployment actually mean for people's lives and how you actually turn those policy and regulatory turns in the right ways to make sure that you start to address the imbalances. But the second thing that the apartheid government did very intentionally was an education and socialization project, a project of conscientizing people's minds to normalize racism, and not only white people normalizing racism, for the rest of us as well, black, colored, Indian people, of this country were taught to normalize racism and the idea of superiority and inferiority of particular groups. And that was in every part of society. It wasn't only confined to schools.
Yeah.
You saw that kind of consciousness building that was happening all the time.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're missing in our society right now. We are actually told in many forums to not talk about race, to not talk about ethnicity or xenophobia. Those conversations are suppressed. And there isn't a clear sense that the government itself has thought through what it takes to socialize people differently.
So as part of the plan, while we're there, sorry to come in, Tessa, we part of the plan, we said we'll take this particular action. We are going to introduce anti-racism training in educational institutions, in public service, as well as in the private sector. Have we taken that action seriously and in earnest?
We certainly have not. And also the language of anti-racism training is already showing the flaws in the thinking. What we need is racial literacy training, where we understand what race is. We understand what racism is. We understand why it is that we are conscientized the ways that we are to see white people or black people in particular ways. It's only by the fact of understanding what it is that's happening that we can then start to avoid it. But just to say to somebody, don't be racist, or treat so-and-so better tomorrow, is not going to change their behavior, because you have to actually change the way they see and understand how racism operates in their own lives, through their families and through their communities. I think we are far way off from any kind of training that re-socializes us, particularly at the individual and the community level.
Let's take a break. We'll come back in a moment, and we'll hear from Wayne as well on the question of the legislative framework that is in place to protect and to, I suppose, ensure that there are measures in place to deal with racism when it rears its ugly head. Let's get your views tonight. Is the agenda or the problem of racism still firmly on the national agenda, or do we have an incidence-based response? 072-110-5584. That's the number in which you can get in touch with us tonight here on In Focus. We'll continue in a moment. Stay with us. Live with us tonight on In Focus on this day of reconciliation as we peruse through the National Action Plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other intolerances, and just take a broader view to see what progress has been made and how far we have come. Tessa Dooms, Professor Christi van der Westhuizen, Wayne Ncube with us tonight, Trevor, Ngwane, as well as Brian Mhlanga. And of course, we're taking your thoughts, 072-110-5584. When one of the components to this plan that would need to be addressed is, of course, the legislative framework, one, for protection, but two, for redress. How far have we come as far as that is concerned? Have we, for example, equipped departments, civil society organs with enough tools to monitor and assess how far we are going as far as the laws that are in place?
Thank you very much. So in my opinion, at least in the last 2 years, we haven't really moved in terms of this. In fact, what we've seen is even more discriminatory legislation coming out of either Parliament or city councils. You think of the recent amendment to the Refugees Act, which provides for a lot more trauma to asylum seekers and refugees who are a protected group singled out in the National Action Plan. You also see very discriminatory bylaws, particularly in the Western Cape, which predominantly target homeless people and essentially target poor and marginalized black communities, and provide prohibitive sanctions against them or allow for their arrest depending on certain activity, which causes further exclusion and segregation in certain areas. So if you look at it from that point of view, and the fact that we still haven't finalized the hate crimes bill, which has been debated for over 5 years now, I don't think from a legislative point of view we're moving in the right direction at all. and that there's a coherent plan to provide a system that will move towards redress. We also see that obviously with the question around land, and very little movement happening in this current administration, just a lot more debating instead of using the tools that are already available in the Constitution to start making headway towards some equitable and fair land redistribution. Yeah. Obviously, the last 2 years with the pandemic, we've seen greater strain on industry, and a lot of that trickling down specifically to communities of color, with the wealth gap, inequality gap all increasing. I think South Africa is now the most unequal society that's regularly recorded on earth. So all those indicators point towards us being in a worse place than when this action plan was placed in place. Yeah. Obviously, that's not to say holistically nothing has happened, and there aren't certain measures that have been put in place and certain victories that the state can take during this time. But cumulatively, it does feel like we're going backwards rather than forward.
Right. I want to come back to you on that a little bit more and get a sense of where does that leave the capacity of the judicial system then to deal with the racially motivated crimes as part of the objectives that this plan is supposed to address. But Brian, let's bring you in here. I mean, when we speak about raising the level of national consciousness in dealing with racism, have we failed? I mean, if you, for example, look at our approach so far, one would describe it as highly party political. We've not found a non-party political way, for example, to deal with racism. Brian, please unmute there for us.
Good evening, Tabo. So there are a lot of political nuances around the whole matter that we are exploring this evening, and people have limited it to issues such as the infrastructure. People have limited to issues of the disparities that exist in our communities and in our country, and those are valid and they need to be acknowledged. However, there's the human side to that. There's the human experience. And when one looks at the human experience, one looks at the lack of connection between the different communities. One looks at the mistrust. One looks at the lack of healing. A few weeks ago, we were mourning the death of our former president of the country. And it really evoked a lot of high emotions in the country. And that in itself could be a dipstick into where the country is at the moment when it comes to matters of reconciliation, and when it comes to matters of healing, and also when it comes to matters of regeneration. I think we are not where we should be 27 years later in our democracy. So, no, not there.
Yeah. And Christi, let's then look a little bit more into this issue of poverty, still largely coinciding with race and ethnicity in the country. What was the plan to reverse that kind of outlook, and how far are we with that plan?
Well, the plan does actually specifically talk about poverty alleviation. It talks about the land question also specifically, but and then it refers obviously to policies that are in place to start to address that. So we know that we've had a land redistribution policy in place since the 1990s. And which has not been successfully implemented. And so there's a failure of implementation that happens. So if you've got a plan like this, the plan will just basically refer you to the policies that exist, the laws that exist, to accelerate land redistribution. But it won't tell you what do we do in the case of the failure of policy implementation, which is what we've seen in relation to land redistribution. So those, and poverty alleviation as well, of course. And then I think Wayne has made a very good point around current actions that are being undertaken by local governments or by the Department of Home Affairs and so forth, that actually also further act to the detriment of poor people and vulnerable people in our society. So we've got on the one hand the policy implementation failure, on the other hand we've got new actions that actually are really to the detriment of poor people. And as a society, we are in a sense also reeling now from the COVID-19 pandemic, And you can see all those fractures in our society being massively exacerbated by all of this. So sometimes you have this very, very loud and actually very unproductive, almost frenetic kind of national discourse around race and racism. And we don't have the opportunity to really connect with each other as South Africans, to really address these things and come to the point that also the Tessa's also raised and Brian and so forth, in terms of particularly how do we change our consciousness as South Africans, because we've been trained in racism, we've been trained in race, and how do we actually upend that? How do we massively transform that into a different situation? And the fact of the matter is, you can't actually do it while we're still so polarized on the socioeconomic level. So the two things will have to go hand in hand.
Yeah. Being polarized, Trevor, on a socioeconomic level, there's an agreement, right? Or is there an agreement, right? That there will be cooperation, for example, between government, the private sector, and civil society to transform the complexion of our economy, in fact, to accelerate and ensure that there is better representativity in the economy of the country. But you know, you've got a number of tools, your equity that you look at, your empowerment, BEE scorecards, and the likes, and so forth. They are not making a dent. Is it just a situation where we sit and say, well, one of these partners, either the private sector or the civil society, they are not playing their part, or is it government that is not playing its part?
Look, BEE is working. I mean, we do have an emergent black bourgeoisie who have joined the tables of white monopoly capital. Maybe there are not many enough, but I think it's an important point to raise, because racism is an ideology. So in a way, there are various ways on a daily basis in which racism, racialism is constantly and continually being recreated and reproduced. So if we take BEE, for example, you know, it is based on racial categorization, and it involves the reallocation of inequality, poverty, and unemployment, and not its abolition. It involves the reshuffling of privilege to benefit some and not all. So as long as, you know, that ideology, that way of doing things on a daily basis by the state, by the captains of industry, you know, racism will continue.
Yeah. So in other words, you're saying there is a need not only to shift, but what approach then should be taken?
Well, you know, some of the speakers have spoken as if, you know, it is a question of improving race relations. But I don't think that is the issue. What must be improved is racial justice, you know, racial, gender, and class justice. Social justice is the only true foundation for improving the relations between people of different skin color, you know, country of origin, and gender. You know, in the old days when we were fighting apartheid, we used to say, you know, there is no peace without justice. So that is what South Africa needs. You know, the land must be returned because it was stolen. The wealth must be taken back because it was stolen. Exploitation of labor must end. This is the foundation. This is the vision we must move towards.
Yeah. So I mean, if you still have, for example, certain quarters of society that says redress should not really be based on skin color, but some of these things should be done on merit, and does that help take the conversation forward?
Look, what we don't want is the continuation of privilege per se. You know, whether those who are privileged are black or white, that is not what we want. We want a better life for all, to go back to that cliche. So we want the poor, we want a massive redistribution of resources. You know, we must, address the underlying causes and dynamics. We must target and end capitalist exploitation. We must target oppression. At the moment, we find the captains of industry, big business, hiding behind the ANC government. You know, everything that big business is doing, inflating prices, paying starvation wages, extracting super profits, taking, you know, through outsourcing, etc., contracting out, taking public money from the state and putting it into their private pockets. These are the things that must end. This is the problem in South Africa, and not only in South Africa, in the world. Yeah. Remember also that, you know, we've got things like xenophobia. Those things, it's a legacy of imperialism, of colonialism, where certain countries had their resources, you know, taken from them. And certain countries like South Africa end up, you know, monopolizing.
And Trevor, I'm with you, I understand, but I want you to be more explicit about what exactly are you saying should happen to take those things away?
Well, I think what we need is socialism. We need ordinary working class people to mobilize, to challenge the power of the capitalist state, because the ANC government is running a capitalist state, a state of exploitation, a state which was built on racism, on colonialism. So we have to mobilize, we have to push back, we have to take back the wealth, we have to take back the means of production, so that, you know, when we produce, all the goods and services that are produced benefit everyone, and not just a few capitalists and some aspirant black bourgeoisie.
Push back, take back the means of production, target a massive redistribution of resources. We'll get some more reaction to that as well from the panel tonight. But let's hear your views, 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. We're back in a moment. Welcome back live with us tonight here on In Focus, in Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. The conversation on how do we move past the legacy of racism. And we're asking you the question tonight. Do you think that the problem of racism is still firmly on the national agenda, or are we responding to sporadic incidences as and when they appear? Tessa Dooms, Professor Christi van der Westhuizen, Wayne Ncube, Brian Mhlanga, as well as Trevor Ngwane with us tonight in this conversation. I saw you, I'll start with Brian. I saw you shaking your head there. Give me what your immediate thoughts are. Push back, take back means of production, target a massive redistribution of resources. These are the things that will push back against the racism in the country.
Yeah, so Thabo, I did smile because I was a bit triggered there, and I'll tell you why. Because I think we are past the point where we past talking policy. We are at a stage now where we should not be talking about policy, but we should actually be monitoring and evaluating the policy that has been set out for us. So in practice, what we have is we've got the best policies, and we've got the best policies both in corporate and in the social and even in the political spheres that are supposedly to be inclusive and actually that promote diversity. But when you look at how some organizations and even how businesses and corporate are going around it, you can actually see that they found loopholes to this. And so when you ask the question that how far are we, you can actually see that the privileged will always remain privileged, and they're not willing to give away their power. And those who are oppressed are really going to remain oppressed. So it is going to be very hard for the ordinary South African to raise.
Is it just because they are not on the same wave, same page with the rest of society on social injustice?
Not at all. It's what power does. With power, that's the definition of power. You can actually determine the future. You hold the keys to the direction where this thing is going to go. So in this case, where the oppressed do not have a negotiating voice at the table, how do we expect to change the narrative?
So how do you build the capacity of those who do not have a voice at the table for them to be able to then have a voice that at least moves us forward as far as the needle is concerned? Wayne?
So I think this is where we expect more action from the state and different state departments, because they have to implement I suppose what we already have in legislation. And I'll use one example of the kind of power disparity. If you think back during Fees Must Fall, when there was a protest, there was a big outsourcing must fall issue as well, where a lot of predominantly black labor was being exploited, still is being exploited throughout, whether it's in government, industry, everywhere. and they don't get the same protection in terms of the Labor Relations Act, one of the things that was fought for in apartheid to kind of end exploitation of black labor. And there were amendments that came through early in the last decade, and none of them had any effect because big industry and the state, who employ a lot of people like this, had lawyers who could go and manipulate the amendments to destroy their effect. And it took until 2017 to get the ConCourt to confirm that those legal mechanisms were unconstitutional. But we still don't see a lot of insourcing complying with the amendments to the Labor Relations Act, because again, not a lot happens through the Department of Labor, not a lot has happened in terms of inspections, the mechanisms to access the CCMA to get equalized or to get your actual employer insource you are difficult given justice's budget being cut down. And so that the kind of lack of initiative from the state, from state departments, our budgetary choices, lack of emphasis, the kind of power economic imbalances that allow access to these institutions ensure that nothing actually moves forward.
Yeah. Tessa, I know you're passionate about this subject of education, and let's stay there a little bit more. The legacy of segregation in our education, do we still need more state intervention there?
Well, we certainly do. I think that we need to talk about what life chances are available to South Africans in this country right now and compare it to the past. And I think if you do that, you realize that when it comes to something as foundational as education, and I think there are other things in the childhood life cycle, like access to food and good nutrition in the first 6 years of life, particularly if we talk about ECD education, there are big lags and gaps there for people who come from particular kinds of communities vis-a-vis people who come from wealth. So there are many things in the child's life that we can see are still replicating the same patterns of inequality that apartheid set up. And that's not only got to do with what content people are getting access to. It's also got to do with things just like the question about spatial distribution and the way in which our societies are set up. It's got to do with the quality of teachers and the pay of teachers that is disproportionate. It's not equal. So you'll have your best teachers who will be teaching in the private sector where they can get higher wages, or you'll have even poor quality teachers in that system getting higher wages than teachers that are working really, really hard in township and rural schools. So there, again, all of those kinds of gaps are things that the state must intervene on. They must make sure that the infrastructure is sorted out, that the quality of education is sorted out, teaching is sorted out. All of those things set up young people in this country for an adult life, which we want to have as a successful adult life in this country. But right now, on the basis of race, on the basis of income, you're not going to get equal outcomes for people. We're starting on a very different base. And when we can talk in this country all that we want to about employment and economic participation. But if we don't start on equal basis when it comes to something as basic as education is, then you are never going to win those battles further upstream. We're never going to win the economic participation battle if we're not getting people on good, solid, equal footing coming out of the gate from childhood into adulthood.
Yeah. Using the words of Trevor, how do we push back and take back that space of education so that it begins to give equal opportunity and equal availability of opportunity to all citizens of the country in a fair manner?
Yeah, for me, we shouldn't have to take back anything in this context right now because we have a government. We have a government that we need to be able to lobby, that we need to be able to change and shift things through the state and its mechanisms. I think protest and collective action is important, But we also must recognize that if we take seriously that we have a democratic state and we have a government and we have all of these levers and policies and people that we're paying high salaries to, we must say we must take control of the state. We must use the machinery of the state and we must get it in our grip. Pushing back against the state or calling for action will only get us so far until we have the right people sitting around those tables, in those buildings, in those offices, in those jobs, so that they can actually pull those levers. We've gotten so complacent in this country, making noise, because that's the way the government now feels. They feel like it's noise, and they can ignore it because they feel like communities will make noise, we'll send out police, and we'll just go through the cycle again and again and again. And so I think that the place that we need to be fighting is not only in the streets, but we must be coming back to the table around political solutions for this governance solutions, and we must make sure that those levers of power in the state are turned in different directions.
Is something like a loss of power, as we've seen in the local government elections, maybe enough of a pushback more than just protests, which, of course, politicians look at it and think, well, you just, one politician actually once said to me, yeah, well, people will protest. I mean, I was like, wow, that's your perception, that's your view of it. Yeah, people will protest and they have a right to. Doesn't mean that actually much will change.
Yeah, I think that is the general perception around politicians particularly. And we do have to make a distinction between the world of politicians and the actual machinery of the state, because there are more than politicians that occupy the state. But I think the question about a loss of power and us using our vote and the electoral system to choose differently, I think does have one role to play in that. But also the right kinds of people stepping up to lead, and the right kinds of people stepping up into the public service to serve, even if it's not through political vehicles. Building the capacity of the state is absolutely central to getting things done and getting the right kinds of decisions passed, and then getting the right kind of implementation. I think sometimes we get fixated on the political, in terms of political parties and their battles and all of those kinds of things, when there is more to this machinery than meets the eye. We have to ask questions about the public servants and the quality of public service that we have, whether or not the right kinds of checks and balances are in place for people who do not deliver when they work in the public service. All of those things matter as we try to reconfigure the state, as we try to reconfigure our society. Our government must work for us. We should not have to burn it all down and start again. We need to reconfigure the thing that we have and make sure it works optimally for all the people of South Africa.
Does the problem of racism still remain on the national agenda, or are we seeing an incidents-related response? 072-110-5584. We'll get your views in a moment. The panel stays on, and of course we'll touch on other areas of this conversation, including the judicial system and its response to racially motivated crimes. Are we paying lip service to zero racism tolerance practices in our workplace, in public spaces, as well as even in our own private spaces? We'll talk more on that when we continue. Yes, Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405. The conversation continues tonight, and the look at what have we achieved as far as the national plan in place to deal with racism, xenophobia, and other related intolerances. Our panel helping us through that conversation tonight. We'll get your views on 072-110-5584. Prof. Christi, zero tolerance to racist practices is what we said we will adopt, and what we continue to confess that we want to practice. But is this just lip service, or do we really see it in earnest in public buildings, public spaces, in our private homes, but also in how we conduct ourselves in business and in other spaces?
Well, I think that there is definitely a much heightened awareness around racism. And it's also been because if you think of these very public events, also via social media and so on, of racism happening, racist incidents, that have really put it foremost, I think, in people's minds that it is, particularly I'm talking now about white people, realizing that this kind of behavior, these kinds of utterances are absolutely unacceptable. So If we look at many other countries, also other secular societies in the world, they don't have this kind of intense public discourse around race and racism. So I think we're not doing too badly in relation to that, except that I do feel that sometimes it gets a bit too shrill and we're basically shouting past one another. And that I don't think is so helpful. And the problem is partly that we haven't really created those spaces where we can engage with one another. If you look at, for example, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, their reconciliation barometer, they find that a very high percentage of South Africans, for example, are still not engaged in interracial relationships with one another, on a home-to-home basis, personal relationships, friendships, and so on. So, and that to a large extent, I believe, is due to our high levels of socioeconomic polarization. So our society remains very much polarized because of this massive class inequality that is race-based and which we've inherited from apartheid. So those challenges remain very much before us. If we think of for example, we've had the equality courts now for a long period of time. They were put in place by the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act in the early 2000s. I think it was the year 2000, in fact. And those equality courts have actually created forums where, as a particular example, incidents of racism can be addressed and can actually bring South Africans face to face, where people who perpetrate racism can actually face up to the pain that it causes, to the harm that it causes, and action can be taken, remedial action can be taken. So I think that's been quite effective. But yet again, I think in terms of our conversation so far, we've really heard that there's, without this structural economic change that we need, it's very hard to actually really confront these issues. And the fact of the matter is, there has been a kind of a convergence of elite interests between the state and the private sector. And we see, you were mentioning, Thabo, the outcome of our local government election. We see a mass withdrawal from the electoral process by South Africans. You see there's a massive disillusionment with politics, and there's a sense of, it doesn't actually matter whether I vote or not. My life is not going to change. And that is that kind of disillusionment with politics and effectiveness of politics is very dangerous for us. We had the July violence this year. That's what happens when people actually get to a point of like, it doesn't actually matter, whether I vote or not. I have to, in a sense, try and look after myself, and because clearly the political elites are not interested in serving the people of South Africa. And I also just want to underline what Tessa was saying around rebuilding the capacity of the state, because the fact of the matter is, when it comes to land redistribution, the policies have been there. The Constitution, as it stands, as Wayne was saying earlier, does allow for the expropriation of land. Brian was also making that comment. We've got the policies in place, but they're not being implemented properly. And part of it's got to do with a breakdown in state capacity. Yeah. So, but we can't, and therefore we can't leave it over to the politicians. We as South Africans have to step up.
When you look at Colini, when you look at Senekal, those are some of the incidences that quickly come to my mind, at least in the last couple of months. Is the judicial system capacitated to deal with racially motivated crime?
So it's a difficult question to answer. I think if you look at the different judgments that have come out of the judiciary, they've properly dealt with developing the law in a very positive manner in terms of racial equality. What hasn't been done is a lot of promotion of the judiciary, for instance, promoting the equality court, making people aware of it, making people aware of the remedies that can be achieved through there. And there's also a big general access to justice issue, making pro bono lawyers available to individuals in the country in a manner that would allow them to access the judiciary at the same rate as industry companies, more affluent people. And so when you look at the judiciary's capacity, I don't think the judiciary is seeing enough cases that would deal with discrimination, racism, xenophobia. What we're also seeing, obviously, is the fact that the judiciary is currently understaffed. There have been budgetary cuts. Currently, there's obviously a lot of controversy with the Constitutional Court, where a lot of judges, a lot of justices there have not been replaced for quite a while, with seemingly no reason whatsoever. The late announcement of the Chief Justice causes a lot of uncertainty in the judiciary. So I don't want to criticize the judiciary. There are obviously problems. There's work that can be done to better capacitate it, but a lot more work has to be done to enable all South Africans and all people in the country to be able to access it.
Yeah. Trevor, one of the issues that has been raised, and it has come up sharply once again with the NPA being in Parliament recently, is the lackadaisic speed at which the question of reparations is being addressed for victims of racism, as recommended by the TRC report. I mean, what message does that send also to would-be racists?
Yeah, I think this country, we need to look at the bigger picture. We need a vision of alternatives. I think we need all those issues arise within the context of an urgent need for qualitative, not just quantitative change, not just arithmetic, summation. In fact, we should address key concepts such as reform or revolution. Someone was mentioning protests. We need to bring the protests together, these fragmented struggles, into a united force. We are faced with a class politics, the protection of class privileges, white monopoly capital, an aspirant black bourgeoisie, looking after itself, its own interests, self-enrichment. Every serious book on the South African transition to bourgeois, to democracy, for example, Adam Habib, the title of his book, The Suspended Revolution, Martin Maré, Revolution Defect, Mark Gefesser, The Dream Defect. So clearly, this revolution is still unfolding, as the students of Fees Must Fall, Rhodes Must Fall, said when they called for decolonization. So this country is at a stage which Kwame Nkrumah called neo-colonialism. This is pretend decolonization, pretend liberation, bourgeois democracy, capitalist democracy, where exploitation, oppression continues, where there is protection of private property, where workers still are being exploited, where people are building, multi-billion empires based on stolen wealth, based on slavery, colonialism, genocide. So clearly, there is no real way forward with this type of system. And we have to learn to speak the truth to power. We have to speak the truth to the youth, to the workers. Amilcar Cabral said, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. During the struggle against apartheid, we came to the understanding it is the system. We have to change the system. We have to overthrow the system of exploitation. Racial capitalism. Even in the USA, they are still struggling with the killing of George Floyd, police brutality, attacks on African Americans, because that system, it's also like ours, settler colonialism, racial capitalism. What we need is an alternative. And that alternative, I'm a Marxist, that alternative should be based on the power of the working class, the power of the producers, workers' power, workers' democracy, a worker state, a different future, a workers' future. Right. We must connect the dots. We mustn't, be partial in our analysis.
That's much appreciated. Let's end it there for tonight. Appreciate your time. Tessa, Prof. Christi, Wayne, Brian, as well as Trevor. And thank you for your engagement. Let's read some of your messages coming through tonight. This one is from Ria in Midrand. The government does not have a direct program to deal with the structural racism. Racism goes hand in glove with power on one side and poverty on the other. There's vast inequality in education, entrenched social injustice, and no measures to address economic emancipation of black people in South Africa. It's me in Pietermaritzburg. Xenophobia has become a political tool used by politicians to mobilize and organize people to achieve a political agenda. Xenophobia in South Africa is the product of racial capitalism that seeks to divide the poor in order to maintain the status quo. Some of your views and thoughts tonight to the conversation. Thank you very much for that engagement on this day of reconciliation.